So this whole area here, from where I'm standing into this direction, okay, was all open pretty much during the time of the Battle of Cool Springs. This farm, this plantation, in case you're curious, planted predominantly two types of crops, wheat and corn, which is pretty typical for the Shenandoah Valley. So this is all devoid of trees. This is all farm fields in that summer of 1864. And it was in these fields that you had, on the night of July the 18th, 5,000 Union soldiers from General James Ricketts' division were scattered all throughout these fields. And that night of July 18th had to be, for the soldiers in Ricketts' command, one of the most uncomfortable moments of their lives, I would argue, for two reasons. First and foremost, as Union soldiers from Thoburn's command retreat that night to this side of the river, the first place they reach, the first people they interact with, are those soldiers from Ricketts' command. And those guys have one question. Thoburn's veterans, they have one question for those troops in Ricketts' division. Why have you been sitting here the whole time while we have been fighting over there? Why haven't you come to our aid and assistance? And I want to help you understand what brings us to this moment. So when the battle opened up and the Confederates started to launch their attack, so Gabriel Wharton launches the attack first. So basically, Gabriel Wharton is attacking the far left end of the Union line, which would be opposite of where we're at. Gabriel Wharton was the main distraction at Cool Spring, however. The main attraction for the Confederates was Robert Rodes' division, who was going to launch an attack against the far northern flank of Thoburn's line. But the idea was Wharton attacks, distracts Thoburn, and then Rodes hits, and then, you know, hopefully would, from a Confederate perspective, annihilate the Union force. That doesn't happen. Now, during that initial attack, George Crook and Horatio Wright were having some really intense discussions closer to Snicker's Gap about what to do. George Crook, by this point, wanted to get Thoburn back across the river because he thought, you know what, there's a river between him and the other 30,000 soldiers in Horatio Wright's pursuit force. His men are going to be obliterated over there. And so Horatio Wright said, no, stay put, keep them where they're at. I'll send reinforcements in the form of James Ricketts. So James Ricketts' division, they march through this area. They kind of stand here. And George Crook and Horatio Wright, they go down to the banks of the Shenandoah to try to find a suitable place for Ricketts to cross. Well, as Ricketts and Crook are looking for this suitable place to cross the division, Ricketts notices there's a whole bunch of Union soldiers coming to this side of the river. Like almost 1,000 men from Colonel Samuel Young's command, which was dismounted cavalry, positioned on the far right end. They don't engage Rodes after Rodes attacks. And so they pull back to this side of the river. And then they start to see other soldiers from Colonel Daniel Frost's brigade, after Frost was mortally wounded, pulling back. And Ricketts looks at all of these soldiers, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them retreating, and he says, I am not going to cross my men, because I think at this stage of the game, the battle is already lost. It would be a suicide mission. I'm just going to keep them here. So George Crook tries to find Horatio Wright. He does. Horatio Wright says, you know what, on second thought, Ricketts is right. Let's just leave him here. So that night, Ricketts' division, they remained here. There would also be Union artillery posted in the mountains. So above us would be Battery G, 1st Rhode Island Light Artillery. Over that direction, Battery E, 1st West Virginia Light Artillery. And then further to the north, Battery C, 1st Rhode Island Light. So you have 3 artillery batteries up in the mountains. So as Ricketts' men were here, there were soldiers from Thoburn's command saying, why didn't you come and help us? And for the rank and file, the privates, the corporals, the sergeants, they said, we wanted to come. But General Ricketts wouldn't allow it. There were Union officers like Colonel William Ely of the 18th Connecticut, who was standing somewhere out here in this field, gathered with what remained of the 18th Connecticut. And so the 18th comes into this battle with about 85, 90 men. Between soldiers who are wounded and captured or killed, by the time they get back to this side of the river, there's maybe 30 or 40 of them left. At that particular moment, Colonel Ely had seen a lot during his Civil War service. He was captured at the Second Battle of Winchester in 1863, as was the majority of that regiment. But this is the only time on record that I can find from Colonel Ely's military service where he is physically brought to tears. And there are other men in Thoburn's command who are brought to tears that night because they are wondering, why is it that nearly 70 of our comrades have been killed, another 300 and some wounded, nearly 60 captured? You all are sitting here and watching this. There's another 25,000 troops in Snicker's Gap watching this. You are watching us being slaughtered. You're watching us being killed. You're watching us being driven back. And aside from the artillery that was placed in the mountains, there was no help given to us. This is what Colonel Ely told the members of his regiment in this general vicinity that night. He said, "Boys, I am willing to lead you against an equal or even double number of rebels. But this being shut up in a slaughter pen, I simply cannot stand." Here is, to me, the great irony of Ricketts' decision not to cross. So Ricketts believed that by keeping his men here, that they would be safe, they would be protected. But that's not the case. One of the things years ago that I started doing with my students and then eventually enlisted the help of my wife during COVID because she didn't have anything to do, was looking at the death records of all the soldiers who were killed out here. And it was easy to kind of look at Thoburn's division, but then I started going through Ricketts' division. And it's really interesting to see how many scores of soldiers in Ricketts' division are killed or wounded on the night of the 18th just by sitting here. And I want to tell you the story of two guys, both from Company C of the 4th New Jersey Infantry, Privates John Price and George Lee. The 4th New Jersey is sitting, again, in this general vicinity. Where specifically, we can't say, but sitting in this general vicinity. And I personally would not want to be sitting here late on the night of July 18th, because late on that night, there is an artillery duel that takes place between the 3 Union batteries in the mountains and 3 Confederate batteries of Lowry, Bryan, and Chapman on the other side of the river. So Confederate batteries, they are trying to dislodge the Union guns. Union guns are trying to do the same. Union guns are firing with great accuracy. Confederate shells are landing short of the mountain. So they are falling in this area. So it means that Ricketts men who think that they're safe, in fact, guess what? They're not all that safe. And so Private Price and George Lee are both mortally wounded out here. Private Price, he's struck in the elbow. I mean, his arm is shattered. He bleeds out and dies later that night. That following afternoon, around 4 o'clock on July the 19th, George Lee, who had been struck by shrapnel in his head from Confederate batteries on the other side of the river, he died. Both of those soldiers, based on letters that were written by the company commander to the widows of those soldiers, reveals to us that they were buried somewhere out in this vicinity. And there are a number of soldiers who were buried out here in this vicinity that night, either from Thoburn's command or from those soldiers who were killed or mortally wounded from Ricketts' division. Some of those soldiers eventually were moved to the National Cemetery in Winchester. Do some remains still stay out here? I don't know. I think there is one instance on Parker's Island that we'll talk about a little bit later on, where there is still probably a soldier or his remains still resting there. Now, while Ricketts' division was navigating this all throughout the night, and again, I just don't understand Horatio Wright. Those of you who are veterans of my tours, I don't really think highly of him. Okay, particularly for what he does at Cedar Creek, defying Sheridan's orders. But in any event, it doesn't occur to you to get your men out of here. Like you've been telling Wright, I don't want to cross because I think my men are in danger. There are artillery shells raining down upon them that night, but yet you keep them here until that following morning. Now, while this is all happening, there's another scene unfolding along the banks of the Shenandoah River to try to not only evacuate wounded, but to try to prevent Confederates from crossing over to this side of the river. And so we're going to head down this path down towards closer to the Shenandoah and pick up our story there. But are there any questions before we do that?
Did keeping men here cost the battle?
I would say yes. So this is kind of one of those, let's play armchair general, sure, hindsight 2020. But you think about it numerically, right? So the Confederates have 8,000 soldiers roughly on the other side engaged. Thoburn goes in with 5,000. So you put these other 5,000 guys in, that's going to give you numerical superiority. I would argue the terrain actually favored the Union forces because the Confederates are coming down from high ground into low ground, and generally the high ground has the advantage unless you are attacking a position that is defended by a stone wall, and that stone wall is built protecting a sunken roadbed. So there's like a natural trench there. There are Union veterans from Thoburn's command who will write in regimental histories, the pages of the National Tribune, which is a weekly newspaper published for Union veterans. They write all kinds of articles after the war asking that very question. And they basically come to the conclusion, and I'm inclined to agree with them. They said that if we would have been properly supported with rickets, we would have won. And this could have been the end of the fighting in the valley, but we weren't. I don't know what I would do as a historian because I don't know to write about in the valley. But, so I guess I owe rickets thanks for that. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in all seriousness, those guys thought if we would have had Ricketts Division, we would have won. Because it's remarkable to think about it that the Confederates make at least 4 separate assaults against the Union position that evening with Rhodes' division. All of those assaults are repulsed, largely not only because of the tenacity of those soldiers on the northern end, but because of the artillery and the bluffs. So you have to think if you have that support, it's going to work to your advantage. Any other questions? All right, we're going to head down.